Alright, so we're going to move more towards macroevolution with this one. And we're going to look at 2 points today. So this is kind of, we'll build some essential questions from these. Is something about early Earth and origin of life. So first one is, what is the origin of life? Okay. And then we'll cover the other part too. So the other half, or the other, I guess, quarter of this chapter in this first half would be major events in the history of life. So what are the major events? And the history of life. Or you could go, what is the history of life? That's fine too. I want to remind you guys too, so as we kind of go through this part, just remember to focus on key points on how you can shorthand things and pay attention to which parts I underline and move forward. So we want to make sure that we're using those skills. So we're going to start with the origin of life. And that'll be our first kind of essential question. And so really focus on what parts, because I will say some of these are kind of difficult for us to kind of fathom. So we're going to hit the high points, and we're going to start immediately with a high point that you do need to know, is that the Earth was formed about 4.6 billion, and that's billion with a B, years ago. So the Earth's about 4.6 billion years old. Okay, worth knowing, but not something you need to write down. So kind of give you those cues again as we get warmed back up into the year, since you know, we're 2017, 2018, you're getting your specific lecture this time. But as the Earth cooled and the bombardment slowed about 3.9 billion years ago, the conditions on the planet were extremely different from those today. So the atmosphere was probably thick with water vapor, various components of volcanic eruptions like nitrogens and its oxides, carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, some real nasty stuff. So lightning, volcanic activity, and UV or ultraviolet radiation were much more intense than they are today. Probably not do so well with the surviving on that one. The earliest evidence of life on Earth comes from these 3.5 billion year old fossils, so almost as old as the Earth is, called stromatolites. Just something to know, don't need to write it down, but they're built by ancient photosynthetic prokaryotes. So, of course, the earliest ones would be prokaryotes or little bacteria. And they're still alive today because they're bacteria, and they just do that. So because these 3.5 billion year old prokaryotes use photosynthesis, it suggests that life first evolved earlier, perhaps as much as 3.9 billion years ago. So even closer to the kind of beginning of Earth. Again, not really key points that you need to write down. We're just kind of going through some of this stuff. So this is where we get some of these fossils. So from volcanic bases, from deep down in the Earth, you get these kind of strata or lines or layers where you can see those fossilized stromatolites. Just for kind of general knowing we'll look at, but again, not something you need to write a whole lot thoroughly here. So the first life may have evolved in about 4 stages. So we maybe had some abiotic, non-living synthesis of small organic molecules. So things that included carbon were brought together like amino acids to make proteins, maybe some nitrogenous bases. Then we joined those things together to make polymers. So we first had to make the monomers, then we made the polymers, then we packaged them into protocells. So monomers to polymers, to like little packages with membranes. And then kind of at some point there was an origin of a self-replicating molecule. So it would have been monomers, polymers, packaging of those things, and then self-replication. So if you want to just sort of write those things down, that's the best way to kind of give it a summary. All right. I will say they kind of discovered some of this stuff doing some experiments. So if they had like a C mixture here, they could do water vapor, and they could have atmosphere, electrodes, sort of give us a little like lightning vibe Like, what happens if we sort of put lightning in a bottle, and then we have rain condensed from that? And so they would have a sample that they analyzed, and sort of from that, as they started to see these kind of, as I can go back to it, but they started to see in the chemical analysis that they actually saw kind of like polymers coming together. So life kind of, you can almost think like Frankenstein style, is that, you know, lightning hit and it came to life. Obviously not exactly, but that's sort of what we're getting at. It's a little harder to wrap your brain around that one, but that's at least sort of the introduction. I'll be honest here on this stuff too, is that the origin of life, I have a harder time understanding. It's not my science or my field of choice, so I will do you a disservice in this section. But if you dig it and have other information to add to it that would make it more interesting and more relevant to you guys, I'm going to share it. I just know that this one's not my best. I'm being truthful. But I'll let you guys know what parts are important to write, as always. All right, so the origins of single-celled and multicellular organisms, kind of in the colonization of land, are key in life's history. So we need to go through life's history. This is going to be a little bit more involved, so there's going to be some things that we need to know. First of all, we've got macroevolution. So macro is the opposite of micro, and so it's going to be large. So macro is kind of large-scale evolution. So we're talking about broad patterns of changes in life on Earth. So big evolution, big broad patterns of changes. Like the whole Earth, watching the whole Earth evolve. So again, the entire 4.6 billion years of Earth, because we repeated it here, so it's kind of important. Wink, wink, hint, hint. Here, I'll put a star on it. All right. It can be divided into 3 eons of geological time. We can look at those. I don't tend to ask a whole lot on the like eons or anything like that. So you can write them if you're interested. Again, I don't tend to ask a whole lot. But there's the Archean, the Proterozoic, and those lasted about 4 billion years. And the Phanerozoic is the last 500 million years. And so that's the eon we're in, if you're interested. All right, so you can see kind of Hadean, Archean, Proterozoic, Phanerozoic. You can kind of see how they relate. So again, origin of Earth, and then prokaryotes showed up. So we got more oxygen in the atmosphere. That kind of gave us the start to the Proterozoic. And then we get more single-celled eukaryotes. You get multicellular things. And by Phanerozoic, then you're starting to get colonization of land and animals. So again, not really interested in kind of all the dates and the names, but more interested that you kind of at least see the pattern of prokaryotes, low atmospheric oxygen, then we get our single-celled or multicellular, and then we actually colonize land. So we've got to get lots of things happening out in the sea before we ever colonize land. That's probably more to note. So prokaryotes lived alone on the Earth for about 1.5 billion years. What a lonely existence. During that time, they transformed the atmosphere. Oh, look, they did good for us. So prokaryotic photosynthesis actually gave us oxygen that enriched the water and the atmosphere of Earth. So our prokaryotes made it possible for the rest of us. Aerobic cellular respiration then allowed prokaryotes to flourish. So then we start moving forward. Again, this is it's a more of the narrative part of it. I can't give you there's not a whole lot to ask from this, other than it's just kind of knowing how these formed. So the oldest fossils of eukaryotes are about 1.8 billion years old. We might write that. That might be handy. All right, so 1.8 billion is when we first start to see eukaryotes. Again, that's the true kernel or the true nucleus. So these are things with a nucleus. I know it looks like it says nucleus, but it's nucleus with a C. You know, tricky parts about writing on screens. So the common ancestor of all multicellular eukaryotes lived about 1.5 billion years ago. The oldest fossils of multicellular eukaryotes are about 1.2 billion years old. So again, that kind of like 1.8 to 1.2 billion years ago is kind of the time frame of us getting some information about eukaryotes. The first multicellular plants and fungi began to colonize land only about 500 million years ago. So like 500 million years is when we actually start to see plants and fungi. Okay, so you're kind of seeing that trend. I guess this would be as good a place as any to kind of take a little pause and to remember we're taking a little break. We're at the 10-minute mark, and then we'll go into looking at humans a little bit more. Again, always take a break. Make sure that you're putting questions on your notes. You've started a little bit of the summary. What are our key points that we've discussed so far? And bring it back. So humans diverged from other primates about 6 to 7 million years ago. So if you look at it, we kind of go back and look at it, about 500 million years ago is when we had plants and fungi. We didn't get animals until 6 to 7 million years ago. So we're just like a blip on the screen here. Homo sapiens in particular, so that's us as humans, about 195,000 years ago. Again, you can write sort of dates to see the timeline, but it's more about how it evolves on a big scale and less about the actual times. The real fascinating part on this one, though, that I like is that if the clock of the Earth's history were rescaled to represent an hour, humans appeared less than 0.2 seconds ago. So you have your whole hour, and we just barely showed up. Isn't that fascinating? All right, this one is worth knowing. So of all the stuff that maybe you jotted a few notes about, this one is at least really, really important. Okay, so radiometric dating is where we get some of this stuff. Okay, so radiometric dating is important. It's based on the decay of radioactive isotopes. So if you remember back to biochem, like way back on that one, sometimes you have an atom. So remember we've got like, let's see if I can get it to work on the screen. It doesn't want to. Okay, here, I'll do it like small scale. But we've got protons and we've got neutrons. Then you've got electrons. Okay, well, sometimes we have atoms that are so large with so many protons and neutrons in the nucleus that they're not stable. And so they'll throw those pieces off, and that's radioactive decay. So some of them do these in a measurable amount. And so we can use the rate of decay and then how much they're going to throw off of that material in the nucleus of that atom. We can figure that rate out, and we express it as a half-life. Okay, so these are half-lives. So the time required for half of that isotope in a sample to decay. So for half of the kind of, like all the atoms in there, for half of them to lose their stuff in the nucleus like they're supposed to. Okay, so carbon-14 is often used for relatively young fossils because it can do up to about 75,000 years old. So carbon-14 is a good one to know. That's the isotope. So radioactive isotopes with longer half-lives are used to date older fossils. So as weird as this kind of sounds, let me try to explain it. So let's say at 0, we would have this whole sample, and 100% of it would include carbon-14, like 100% of it. And I can't remember. I'm going to have to like half make it up. I'm sorry. I didn't look it up before we did this. But over time, what happens to that sample is that if I can measure a sample, again, just bear with me how all that's done is someone else's job. But let's say we measure a sample. We just take any random sample. And half of that sample, now the carbon has decayed. And let's say, again, I'm making it up. You can correct me later because sometimes I forget stuff. It's nitrogen, whatever, and the other half of that sample is still carbon-14. Well, looky there. I say, grabbed a sample, half of it's nitrogen, half of it's carbon-14. Well, then it's 5.7 thousand years, words. Okay, it's 5,700 years old based on that sample. Same thing. If my sample is like 75% like whatever the nitrogen, whatever it breaks down to, and only 25% is the carbon-14, well, then I know it's 11,000 years old. So that's sort of how that works with half-life. How all that stuff, like why does it break down in that way? If that's really like getting your goat, you can look at it, but we don't want to go into the detail. I just want you to know that that's how half-lives work. It's based on those fractions. Again, it's like half of a half each time. And that's how we're actually able to determine the age of something. So that's a big one to know. Okay, So a fossil's age can be inferred from the ages of the rock layers above or below the stratum also. So we can do some what's called relative dating. So that was radiometric. This is going to be called relative dating. I'm not going on dates. This isn't a Match.com thing. It's just a... Oh no, did I not make a... Where'd my picture go? Okay. So relative dating would look like this. So let's say I'm going to give you a half of a mountain here or whatever. And this is eroded from like river stuff. But if I have all these layers in it, and down here I have a fish fossil, right here I have a... And use your imagination on this one. It's a... I don't know. It's a coral fan thing. And then here I have a shell. Yeah, that's what I have there. Then what it would say is that the shell right here is younger than the fish. So the fish fossil is older than the shell fossil because it's further down. So that's sort of relative ages, is that rock layers above and below the stratum. Stratum, by the way, if you're not sure on that one, literally just means layer. So it's based on the layer where it's found. So this fan thing I made is going to be older than the shell, but it is going to be younger relatively than the fish. And that should just make sense. It's deeper down, it's older. Okay. I'll write that for you. Further down equals older, sort of. In that sense. That's oversimplified, but you get the idea. Okay. Next part for us to talk about. So the geologic record is based on the sequence and the ages of fossils in rock strata. Again, strata is just layer, so in rock layers. Okay, so we'll go into like more scientific-y detail. So in the most recent, in our Phanerozoic eon, it includes the past 542 million years. And so they're divided into 3 eras. We have the Paleozoic era, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic era. So Mesozoic is like when dinosaurs were, and Cenozoic is like our current. So you can think Ceno is with a C, it's current. That's how I like it. Alright. Okay. So the boundaries between the eras are marked by mass extinctions. And you can think about that kind of like, think to your Jurassic kind of thing, Jurassic Park business. We have dinosaurs. Dinosaurs going extinct marked the end of that particular era. So that one's at least, here, I'll put a star by that one so we know that one. It's mass extinctions mark the eras. Okay, so it is a little hard to see, but we think of the dinosaurs and those kinds of things, but we also had some other things kind of go extinct, and that kind of helped us get our thing. Let's see. Flowering plants appear and diversify. Many groups of organisms, including dinosaurs, become extinct at the end of this period. So Mesozoic is ended by dinosaurs on that one. Cenozoic is still current. What happened for Paleozoic? Radiation of reptiles, origin of most present-day groups of insects, extinction of some marine and terrestrial organisms that end that period. So it was the extinctions that helped us kind of end each of those eras. All right, so you can see the whole list. I will never ask you to memorize that. Lord knows I don't. And it would be very mean of me to be like, oh yeah, you have to memorize that. Oh no, I don't know those. Again, I'm not doing you the greatest service on those, but at least so you can have seen them and how that works. So something we can actually do, I forgot we were doing this one on here, but we have the time, and it's a good one to start with, is the mechanisms of macroevolution. Okay, so you might throw in another essential question of mechanisms. We're covering quite a bit here in this chapter. But this one, hopefully, you should have learned from sort of an earth science time before. This should be at least sort of a review. By the way, we are at about 19 minutes, so it is a good place to stop and take a break if you need to before we move on to the last little bit here. home stretch. Okay, so according to the theory of plate tectonics, so plate tectonics, we've got Earth's crust divided into giant irregularly shaped plates that essentially float on the underlying mantle. Okay, so we've got a process called continental drift. So we've got continents and they drift and they float on that mantle and they cause the plates to move. So since the origin of multicellular life about, again, 1.5 billion years ago, there have been 3 occasions in which the land masses of Earth have come together to form a supercontinent. Hopefully you remember a supercontinent. Give you a little reminder of Earth kind of science on this one. We got an inner core and outer core. The mantle kind of is liquidy stuff, and then you've got the kind of dried crust on the outside that floats on that particular mantle, and that's where all this business is happening, is on the crust. Okay. All the stuff's going on the crust. Okay, so we've got all of our kind of plates here that we can see, just all the like fault lines, and we know these kind of mapped out by volcanoes and earthquake activities and that kind of business. So we can see some of these. So about 250 million years ago, plate movements brought the land masses together in a supercontinent that we know as Pangaea. So I wouldn't ask you to know the time on that one, but that is our major landmass that's worth knowing, so we need to write Pangaea and make sure that we know it. So the physical environment and climate changed dramatically, and biological diversity was reshaped. So during that Mesozoic era, which the Mesozoic one was when we had the dinosaurs. So during the Mesozoic, Pangaea started to break apart, causing a geographic isolation of colossal proportions. So at the end of the Mesozoic era, some 65 million years ago, the modern continents were beginning to take shape. Again, general information, don't have to write a whole ton of this down. The history of continental merges and separation explains a pattern of biogeography, which of most of this section, like other than the really things I've highlighted, we'll take a look about how biogeography works. Now you can use life to kind of understand the geography, so how Earth is coming together and how all those pieces kind of fit in there. Not the political boundaries, just the kind of like life ones, the ones that are on Earth, those masses. Okay, so the study of the past and present distribution of organisms, so life within that landscape and that geography on the Earth. Bio-Earth, so life, Earth graphing. Okay, there we go. So, back in the day, the end, actually, at the beginning of the Mesozoic, we had Pangaea. All the parts kind of fit together. During the Mesozoic, they started to move around a bit, and at the end, we see something similar to today, and then where they actually move to where we have our present kind of situation of our land masses. So a little connection, volcanoes and earthquakes result from the movements of those crustal plates. Hopefully we'll learn that at some point in time. The boundaries of plates and the hotspots of volcanic activity and earthquake activity. California's frequent earthquakes are a result of the movement across the San Andreas Fault, which I think they've made that movie. I didn't watch it. You guys will have to tell me if you saw San Andreas and if it was good or terrifying, or if we need to watch it as a group. So there is a movie, I think, about that. But it's part of the border where the Pacific and the North American plates grind together and gradually slide past each other, which is not always nice. Okay, so here's the San Andreas Fault. So it's that kind of western line of California. So it lies out there, just kind of hits the side there. And those two different plates will then kind of move past each other there. So some other things, extinction is inevitable in a changing world, so the fossil record shows us that a vast majority of species that have ever lived are now extinct. So extinction is kind of part of the process. Over the last 500 million years, 5 mass extinctions have occurred. In each event, more than 50% of the Earth's species went extinct. that's just the only constant is change. So just to share a couple with you, again, not super worried about things, but there was a Permian mass extinction. It occurred about 251 million years ago. It defines the boundary between Paleozoic and Mesozoic eras. It claimed 96% of the marine animals and took a tremendous toll on terrestrial life. Just some of the other ones. There was the Cretaceous mass extinction. It was about 65 million years ago. This caused a loss of more than half of the marine species, lineages of terrestrial plants. This is what actually got the dinosaurs. Okay. It was likely caused by a large asteroid that struck Earth and would have blocked light and severely disturbed the global climate for months. Okay, so asteroid, boom, it hits Yucatan, and then you end up with a crater, and you end up with a real bummer for dinosaurs. Bummer. So mass extinctions affect biological diversity profoundly. So if you think back to kind of the bottlenecking effect, if you lose a whole bunch of stuff, you're opening up space for whatever kind of genetic stuff is there to kind of repopulate, but you're changing the genetic diversity on a large scale. Okay, so it took 100 million years for the number of marine animals to recover after the Permian mass extinction. Is a sixth extinction underway? And this is a really valid question. You know, it's a good discussion question to have. I don't recommend it. If you're studying for other things, don't. But if you really are struggling on a potential question to have in AVID class, that might be a good one to ask. And you trust me, if I hear that this one comes up in an AVID class and you didn't come correct with a whole bunch of well, this is happening and this is happening that I'm not going to give you, I'm mad and I'm going to find you. But if you're going to do it, do the discussion right and do a little research and talk about, is there another extinction underway? We've lost a whole bunch of things. A lot of things are becoming extinct, and it may take a long time to recover. One last thing to discuss here is that adaptive radiations are a period of evolutionary change in which new species evolve from a common ancestor, and often following colonization of new exploited areas. So when there are mass extinction, there are sort of then unexploited areas that we can have adaptive radiation fill in those gaps. So adaptive radiation have followed some of those mass extinctions when survivors became adapted to those vacant ecological roles or niches in their communities. So, for example, mammal underwent a drastic adaptive radiation after the extinction of the terrestrial dinosaurs about 65 million years ago. Because if your major predator happens to go extinct, well, then that just leaves a way for them. I think that would have been called the Cambrian explosion. I'm not sure that I'm talking about that a whole heck of a lot, but that whole adaptive radiation business where we have things like we have this huge explosion of diversity, that's the Cambrian explosion. So again, you can kind of see ancestors, we've got kind of extinction of dinosaurs, and then mammals and marsupial, which, I mean, they're all mammals anyway. So all of these particular mammals here have really, except for monotremes, poor guys, they haven't done a whole lot. But the rest of them have really, adaptive and radiated outwards, and we got lots and lots of diversity, which we'll get to discuss a little bit later during the animal section. Okay, so the fossil record can tell us what great events in history of life have been, when they occurred. They can tell us, I will say this is a good idea to write this down. Fossil records can tell us about continental drift, mass extinctions, adaptive radiation, and they can give us a big picture view of how these changes came about. We're now increasingly able to understand the basic biological mechanisms that underlie the changes that we see in the fossil record. But these are the things the fossil record can tell us, which helps us with that macroevolution, or the stuff on the big scale. All right, a couple other things. There are a field of Evo-Devo, which is kind of interface of evolutionary biology and then also development control. So it's evolution and development. So just as evolutionary and developmental biology. Oops, there we go. So it examines slight genetic changes that can produce major morphological differences. And we're going to look at some really cool examples. So genes that program developmental control, rate, timing, and pattern, so spatial pattern of change in an organism's form as it develops. It's just putting the parts in the right place. It's sort of like a blueprint. That's what spatial pattern. It gives it the right blueprint. Like your arm's supposed to go right here and not somewhere else. Feet should go at the end of the leg and not maybe on the face. Like, it's blueprinty stuff. But many striking evolutionary transformations are the result of the change in the rate and timing of developmental events. So pedomorphosis, pedo is actually means like sort of like kid. You go to a pediatrician, so that's a doctor that works specifically with kids. So pedo is like sort of a kid. So it's a process where we have a change in form towards the kid form. So read that here. Is the retention of the adult body structures that were juvenile features or like baby features in the ancestral species. So the axolotl is a really good example because it has mature adults that retain gills and other kind of larval or baby features. Okay, so he's got his external gills and his little happy face. No, he's so cute. But that's pedomorphosis because that's sort of a baby feature to have the gills on the outside. All right, so slight changes in relative growth of different body parts can change an adult form substantially. So skulls of humans and chimpanzees are similar as fetus, but as they become adults, they change in rapid ways. Just so you can see this one. So here's a chimpanzee fetus and a baby human fetus. And you see about the same shape, about the same things going on. But as they develop, there's definitely kind of an elongation of the kind of jaw region, whereas in humans, it's just, you know, we just get our giant head and, I don't know, maybe where the ego goes. No, I'm just kidding. But still, it's different shapes that as we develop as adults, they become drastically different. So sometimes the baby features are similar, which is how we know we're all connected there. So that's where we end that one. So hopefully through some of those parts you were able to kind of narrow down what parts you needed to know. If you're not sure, or you're always curious, or should I write this or not this, just shoot me an email and ask. Let me know if you need anything at all, and we'll keep working.